Professor Krelix adjusted his ocular sensors for the third time this morning, watching the oddest collection of students he had ever taught shuffle into advanced quantum mechanics. The Galactic Academy prided itself on bringing together the brightest minds from across known space, but honestly, some days he wondered if the admissions board had lost their collective sanity. Take today's crowd, for instance. 3 towering Altarians sat in the back row, their crystalline blue skin gleaming under the artificial lighting. A pair of Centaurian twins occupied the middle section, their tentacles already busy taking notes before class even started. And then there was the Zephyrian in the front, Vorath something or other, whose ego was apparently as inflated as his home planet's atmospheric pressure. But the strangest sight of all, the small, pale creature sitting quietly in the corner. Maya Torres, the human exchange student. She looked so unremarkable, so fragile, so utterly out of place among beings who had mastered interstellar travel before her species discovered fire. Well, this should be interesting. Now then. Professor Krelix began, his voice echoing through the lecture hall. Today we will be examining the theoretical impossibility of instantaneous matter transmission across quantum fields. As you all know, the energy requirements alone would necessitate the complete conversion of a small moon into pure power. The Altarians nodded sagely, their multiple eyes blinking in synchronized understanding. The Centaurian twins whispered calculations to each other in their native tongue, tentacles dancing across their data tablets. Even the notoriously arrogant Zephyrians seemed to be paying attention. Well, most of them anyway. Vorath Kelmarix, the largest Zephyrian in the class, stretched his 7-foot frame and let out what could generously be called a chuckle. Professor, surely we are not wasting time explaining concepts that even first-year students from civilized worlds would grasp? I mean, he gestured dismissively toward Maya's corner. We do have less developed minds present. A ripple of amusement passed through the classroom. The Altarians exchanged glances, their translator implants picking up the subtle insult. One of the Centaurian twins actually snorted, which was quite an achievement considering their respiratory system. Maya Torres, meanwhile, continued taking notes with what appeared to be a primitive writing instrument. An actual pen, on actual paper. How quaint. Perhaps, continued Vorath, warming to his audience, we could cover some more basic concepts first? Maybe the fundamentals of fire-making, or wheel construction. More laughter erupted from the students. I hear Deathworlders are particularly skilled at hitting things with rocks. Professor Krelix felt his secondary heart skip a beat. This was exactly the kind of interspecies tension the Academy tried to avoid. He glanced at Maya, expecting to see embarrassment, anger, or at least some reaction to the increasingly obvious mockery. Instead, she simply turned a page in her notebook and kept writing. Her expression remained as calm and unreadable as a neutron star's event horizon. If anything, she seemed bored? How very strange indeed. When Professor Krelix called for a 15-minute break, the students scattered like photons hitting a prism. The Altarians huddled together, discussing the finer points of quantum field theory in their melodic language. The Centaurian twins slithered toward the refreshment dispensers, their tentacles already reaching for the caffeine supplements. And Vorath? Well, Vorath had apparently decided that 15 minutes was plenty of time to establish the social hierarchy once and for all. He approached Maya's corner with the swagger of someone who had never encountered a problem he couldn't solve with his considerable size and equally considerable arrogance. At 7 feet tall and built like a walking fortress, Vorath cast a shadow that could eclipse a small moon. His golden skin gleamed with what his species considered the peak of physical perfection, and his 4 arms were crossed in a gesture that screamed intimidation. So, he said, looming over Maya's desk like a particularly unpleasant weather system, the little Deathworlder thinks she belongs in advanced classes, does she? Maya looked up from her notes, her expression as neutral as a diplomatic treaty. I think, she said quietly, that I am here because I qualified for admission just like everyone else. Oh, qualified. Vorath laughed, a sound like grinding metal. Tell me, Primitive, What is the quantum resonance frequency of a Class 7 stellar core during supernova collapse? Approximately 10.7 terahertz, assuming standard stellar composition and accounting for relativistic effects, Maya replied without hesitation. Though the frequency shifts dramatically in the final microseconds due to gravitational time dilation, Vorath's golden complexion flickered slightly. That was actually correct. Down to the decimal point. Lucky guess, he growled, leaning closer. What about the theoretical maximum efficiency of a zero-point energy extraction matrix? 63.4%, limited by quantum uncertainty principles and the fundamental constants of space-time geometry. Maya's voice remained perfectly calm, as if she were discussing the weather rather than concepts that had stumped civilizations for millennia. The other students had begun to notice the confrontation. Conversations died as more eyes turned toward the corner where David was very clearly not backing down from Goliath. Vorath's 4 hands clenched into fists. This was not going according to plan. The primitive was supposed to be cowering by now, not calmly reciting advanced physics like she was reading from a shopping list. "You think you are so smart," he hissed, moving even closer until his breath was hot against Maya's face. "But intelligence means nothing without strength, without power. Your pathetic little world has not even colonized its own solar system, while my people have ruled star systems for millennia." "That's nice," Maya said, and went back to her notes. "That's nice?" Vorath's rational mind, what little remained of it, recognized that he was being dismissed. Not argued with, not feared, but simply dismissed. Like he was an annoying insect buzzing around a picnic. "Look at me when I am speaking to you, Deathworlder." One of his massive hands shot out and grabbed Maya's arm, intending to jerk her to her feet and establish once and for all who was the dominant species in this particular corner of the galaxy. Maya's head turned slowly, and for the first time since the confrontation began, Vorath saw something in her eyes that wasn't boredom. It was calculation. "Let go of my arm," she said quietly. "Or what?" Vorath sneered, tightening his grip. "What could a fragile little creature like you possibly do to someone like me?" Maya smiled then, and it was not a pleasant expression. "I guess you're about to find out." What happened next would be analyzed, debated, and replayed in security footage for decades to come. Xenobiologists would write papers about it, military strategists would study it, and first-year physics students would use it as a prime example of why you should never, ever underestimate the kinetic energy potential of an angry Deathworlder. It started with Maya's left hand. While Vorath was busy congratulating himself on his intimidation tactics, Maya had quietly shifted her weight, planted her feet, and calculated the exact angle needed for maximum force transfer. Her free hand moved in what appeared to be a casual gesture, almost like she was swatting at a particularly annoying fly. The palm strike hit Vorath's solar plexus with the precision of a surgical laser and the force of a small meteor. Now, to understand what happened next, one must appreciate the fundamental differences between Zephyrian and human physiology. Zephyrians, for all their size and apparent strength, had evolved on a world with gravity roughly equivalent to 60% of Earth's standard. Their bones were lighter, their muscle density lower, their entire skeletal structure designed for efficiency rather than raw durability. Humans, on the other hand, were the product of a gravity well that had been trying to crush them into paste for millions of years. The impact was immediate and devastating. Vorath's grip on Maya's arm vanished as every molecule of air in his lungs decided to relocate somewhere else in a hurry. His forearms flailed wildly as his body lifted off the ground, defying what most of the watching aliens had assumed were the basic laws of physics. He flew backward through the air in a graceful arc that would have been beautiful if it hadn't been accompanied by the sound of vertebrae playing a percussion solo. The crash landing was even more spectacular. Vorath hit the far wall of the lecture hall with a sound like a construction accident, his spine compressing in ways that nature had never intended. The impact left a Vorath-shaped dent in the reinforced polymer wall, complete with stress fractures radiating outward like a spiderweb. Then he slid down the wall and crumpled to the floor in a heap of golden limbs and wounded pride. The silence that followed was so complete that Professor Krelix could hear his own circulatory system working overtime. 23 pairs of alien eyes stared at the scene, their minds struggling to process what they had just witnessed. Maya calmly straightened her shirt, picked up her pen, and went back to her notes. "Holy fusion cores," whispered one of the Altarians, his voice barely audible. She moved him. She actually moved him. "Impossible," breathed a Centaurian twin, her tentacles twitching with nervous energy. Her Vorath masses at least 200 standard units. The force required to generate that trajectory would be significant, Maya said without looking up from her calculations. Though fairly basic biomechanics, really. Leverage, momentum transfer, and proper form. My species has been perfecting these techniques for quite some time. A low groan from the far wall indicated that Vorath was still alive, though probably wishing he wasn't. Professor Krelix activated his emergency communicator with shaking appendages. "Medical emergency in Lecture Hall 7, he reported, his voice cracking slightly. "Student down, possible spinal compression. Cause of injury," he paused, staring at Maya, who was now solving quantum equations like nothing had happened. "Cause of injury, physics." The medical team arrived within minutes, their antigrav stretchers and diagnostic equipment filling the room with purposeful chaos. The lead medic, a competent Centaurian named Dr. Vilas S.H., immediately began scanning Vorath's crumpled form with growing confusion. "This is unusual," she muttered, her tentacles dancing over her instruments. "The impact pattern suggests collision with a high-velocity projectile, but the security footage shows no such object. The force vectors are all wrong for a fall. And these compression fractures." She paused, her large eyes widening. "These compression fractures suggest an impact force of approximately 15,000 newtons. That's impossible. Nothing in this room could generate that kind of kinetic energy." "Actually," Maya said, finally looking up from her notes, "a properly executed palm strike from a human female of my approximate mass and muscle density generates roughly 16,000 newtons of force at point of impact. Give or take a few hundred, depending on technique and target resistance." Dr. Velaseshi's tentacles stopped moving entirely. 16,000 newtons? But that would require muscle density approximately 3 times greater than any known sapient species, bone structure capable of withstanding extreme stress loads, with neural response times that border on the impossible. "Yes," Maya agreed cheerfully. "It would, wouldn't it?" The medical team carefully loaded Vorath onto a stretcher, his golden skin now several shades paler and his pride presumably located somewhere in the lower stratosphere. As they wheeled him toward the exit, he managed to lift his head and look back at Maya with a mixture of pain, confusion, and something that might have been newfound respect. What are you?" he wheezed. Maya smiled that same unsettling smile and returned to her quantum mechanics homework. "I'm human," she said simply. "We're the species that learned to throw rocks really, really hard." Professor Krelix found himself in the unusual position of having his entire understanding of xenobiology turned upside down by a student who was currently doodling what appeared to be mathematical equations in the margins of her notebook. The other students had formed a respectful semicircle around Maya's desk, maintaining what they probably considered a safe distance from the small creature who had just redefined their understanding of physics. "Miss Torres," Professor Krelix began, his voice carefully controlled, "perhaps you could elaborate on your species' apparent physical capabilities? For educational purposes, of course." Maya looked up, seeming genuinely surprised by the attention. "Oh, you want to know about human biology? Sure, I suppose that makes sense. Most people find it pretty interesting once they get past the initial shock." She set down her pen and leaned back in her chair, apparently gathering her thoughts. "Where should I start? The gravity thing is probably the most obvious. Earth's surface gravity is about 9.8 meters per second squared, which I gather is significantly higher than most worlds that produce sapient life." One of the Altarians, still visibly shaken, raised a trembling appendage. "How much higher?" "Well, Altair Prime has surface gravity of about 6.2 meters per second squared, if I remember correctly. Centauri Beta is around 5.8, Zephyr is. Maya paused, doing quick mental calculations. About 5.9, I think? So Earth's gravity is roughly 60 to 70% stronger than what most of you are used to. Professor Krelix felt his primary brain struggling to process this information. You are saying that every human carries the equivalent of additional body weight at all times? Exactly. Maya brightened, apparently pleased that someone was following along. Every step we take, every movement we make, every breath we draw is against a gravitational force that would be considered punishing on most civilized worlds. Our entire musculoskeletal system has evolved to function in what you would consider a high-gravity environment. She stood up, and several students instinctively stepped back. Maya either didn't notice or politely ignored their reaction. But it's not just gravity, she continued, beginning to pace in the small area the other students had cleared around her desk. Earth's atmospheric pressure is also significantly higher than galactic standard, about 101.3 kilopascals at sea level, compared to the 60 to 80 kilopascals that most of your worlds maintain. The Centaurian twins exchanged nervous glances. That would make breathing difficult for most species, one of them ventured. Right again. Our lungs have evolved to extract oxygen efficiently from a dense, high-pressure atmosphere. Our cardiovascular system has to work against both higher gravity and higher atmospheric pressure just to keep us alive. Our hearts are essentially high-performance pumps designed to operate under extreme conditions. Professor Krelix was frantically taking notes, his academic mind racing to keep up with the implications. What about bone density? Muscle fiber composition? Oh, that's where it gets really interesting, Maya said, her eyes lighting up with enthusiasm. Human bone density is approximately 40% higher than the galactic average for sapient species. Our bones are essentially living composite materials, designed to handle enormous stress loads without fracturing. And our muscle fibers. She paused, flexing her arm in a gesture that made several aliens take another step backward. Human muscle tissue has a much higher percentage of fast twitch fibers than most species. We are literally built for explosive movement and sustained power output. An Altarian student, his curiosity apparently overcoming his caution, leaned forward. But surely there are disadvantages to such robust physiology? Maya nodded thoughtfully. Absolutely. We require significantly more calories to maintain our metabolic processes. Our bodies generate more heat, we need more water, we have higher nutritional requirements across the board. Efficiency-wise, we are actually pretty terrible compared to most galactic species. Then why, Professor Krelix asked, his voice filled with genuine scientific curiosity, would evolution favor such an apparently wasteful design? Maya's expression grew more serious. Because Earth tried to kill us, constantly, for millions of years. She began counting on her fingers, and Professor Krelix noticed that even her hands looked different when examined closely. More substantial, more dangerous. Ice ages that lasted millennia. Volcanic eruptions that blocked out the sun for years at a time. Massive predators that made Vorath look like a house pet. Diseases that could wipe out entire populations. Natural disasters that could level continents. Our planet has thrown everything it possibly could at us, and the only members of our species who survived were the ones who were tough enough, fast enough, and stubborn enough to keep fighting back. The lecture hall was completely silent now, every student hanging on Maya's words. We are persistence hunters, she continued, her voice taking on an almost hypnotic quality. We do not have the fastest reflexes in the galaxy, or the strongest bite, or the sharpest claws. What we have is the ability to just keep going when everything else gives up. We can run for hours without stopping. We can survive injuries that would kill most species. We can adapt to environments that would be considered uninhabitable by galactic standards. She looked around the room, making eye contact with each student in turn. We learned to make tools because we had to. We learned to cooperate because we had to. We learned to think our way out of problems because raw strength was not always enough. But underneath all that civilization, all that technology, All those philosophical discussions about the nature of existence, Maya smiled, and once again it was not entirely pleasant. We are still the species that survived everything our planet could throw at us. Professor Krelix set down his stylus, his appendages trembling slightly. So when Vorath grabbed your arm, he triggered a reflex that has kept my species alive for millions of years, Maya said simply. The reflex that says when something tries to hurt you, you hurt it back. Harder, faster, and with extreme prejudice. She sat back down and picked up her pen. Now, did you want to continue with the quantum mechanics lecture? I have some questions about the theoretical applications of zero-point energy extraction. Professor Krelix stared at her for a long moment, then looked at the Vorath-shaped dent in his wall, then back at Maya. Yes, he said quietly. I think we should definitely continue with the lecture. Word traveled fast in a closed environment, like the Galactic Academy. By the time Professor Krelix had finished his quantum mechanics lecture, half the campus had heard some version of what had happened in Lecture Hall 7. By dinner time, the story had evolved into everything from the human student defeated a Zephyrian in single combat to a Deathworlder destroyed an entire wall with her bare hands. Maya, for her part, seemed blissfully unaware of her newfound celebrity status. She attended her remaining classes, completed her assignments, and continued to sit quietly in corners taking notes with her primitive writing implements. The only difference was that now she had a 5-foot radius of empty space around her wherever she went. Dean Fluxandra, a distinguished Altarian with over 3 centuries of academic experience, found herself in the unusual position of having to file an incident report that defied conventional explanation. She sat in her office, staring at the security footage for the 15th time, trying to figure out how to explain to the Galactic Education Council that one of their exchange students had launched another student across a room using what appeared to be basic hand-to-hand combat techniques. Computer, replay segments 7.3 through 7.8. Reduce speed to 25%, she commanded. The holographic display showed Maya's palm strike in slow motion. The dean watched as the human student's muscles tensed, her body weight shifted, and her hand connected with Vorath's torso with surgical precision. Even at reduced speed, the violent efficiency of the movement was startling. Fascinating, she murmured. Computer, analyze force vectors and calculate impact energy. Impact energy calculated at approximately 16,847 newtons, the computer replied in its maddeningly cheerful voice. This exceeds recommended safety parameters for inter-student physical contact by a factor of 47. Dean Fluxandra's tentacles twitched with what might have been amusement. Note in official report, incident was the result of cultural misunderstanding regarding appropriate physical interaction protocols. Recommend enhanced orientation program for students from high-gravity worlds. Meanwhile, in the Academy's medical wing, Vorath was having his own educational experience. Dr. Velaseshe had finished her examination and was reviewing the results with barely concealed fascination. 3 compressed vertebrae, 4 fractured ribs, and extensive bruising, she reported, her tentacles dancing over the diagnostic readouts. The good news is that everything will heal completely with proper treatment. The interesting news is that the impact pattern suggests your attacker has bone density approximately 2.7 times greater than galactic standard. Vorath, who was currently suspended in a healing tank filled with regenerative fluid, managed a weak laugh. She is not my attacker, Doctor. She is my teacher, I suppose. Your teacher? I learned something important today, Vorath said quietly. I learned that size and strength mean nothing if you do not understand what you are facing. I also learned that the smallest beings can sometimes be the most dangerous. Dr. Velasesse's large eyes blinked slowly. Will you be filing a complaint against the human student? Vorath was quiet for a long moment. No, I grabbed her first. On my world, that would be considered an act of aggression. I suspect it means the same thing on hers. She simply responded appropriately. Back in his office, Professor Krelix was reviewing the day's events and making notes for future lectures. The dent in his wall had become something of a conversation piece, and he had already decided to leave it as a permanent reminder. He was deep in thought when his door chimed. "Come in," he called. Maya Torres entered, carrying her notebook and looking slightly uncertain. "Professor? I hope I'm not interrupting. I wanted to apologize for the disruption in your class today." Professor Krelix set down his stylus and really looked at the human student for the first time. She was small, barely reaching his shoulder even when he was seated. Her skin was pale, her hair an unremarkable brown, her clothing simple and practical. Everything about her appearance suggested fragility, vulnerability. Everything except her eyes. Her eyes held the steady, unblinking gaze of a predator. "Miss Torres," he said carefully, "you have nothing to apologize for. If anything, today's events have provided us all with valuable insights into the diversity of sapient life in our galaxy." "Still, I probably should have warned everyone about human reflexes," Maya said. "We can be unpredictable when startled." Professor Krelix thought about the calculated precision of her strike, the careful way she had positioned herself before acting, the complete lack of surprise on her face when Vorath went flying across the room. "Yes," he said slowly, "unpredictable. I will be sure to make note of that in my species interaction protocols." Maya smiled, and this time it was genuinely pleasant. "Thank you for understanding, Professor. Oh, and I had a question about tomorrow's assignment on temporal mechanics." As she launched into her question about the theoretical implications of faster-than-light communication, Professor Krelix found himself marveling at the contradiction she represented. Here was a being who could discuss advanced physics with the best minds in the galaxy one moment and casually launch a 200-pound alien across a room the next. Truly, he thought, the universe was a far more interesting place than he had ever imagined. 3 weeks later, the Galactic Academy issued its first-ever Special Considerations for High-Gravity World Students Handbook. The document, which quickly became required reading for all faculty and staff, included helpful sections such as understanding Deathworld reflexes, appropriate physical interaction protocols, and why you should never, ever grab a human without permission. Maya Torres continued her studies with characteristic quiet determination. Her reputation had spread throughout the campus, but not in the way anyone might have expected. Students didn't avoid her out of fear. Instead, they approached her with genuine curiosity and respect. The Altarians invited her to their study groups. The Centaurians asked for her insights on biomechanics. Even the Zephyrians, once they got over their collective wounded pride, began to appreciate the unique perspective she brought to their discussions. Vorath, after his recovery, became something of an unlikely ally. He would often be seen walking with Maya between classes, their conversations ranging from advanced physics to comparative evolutionary biology. When asked about their friendship, he would simply smile and say, "She taught me that true strength comes in many forms, some of them very, very small." Professor Krelix found himself incorporating new elements into his lectures, drawing on Maya's insights about problem-solving under extreme conditions. Her casual observations about human adaptability had opened entirely new avenues of research into species development and survival strategies. But perhaps the most significant change was in how the Academy approached the concept of diversity itself. The incident had served as a stark reminder that intelligence and capability could not be measured by size, appearance, or even technological advancement. The quiet student in the corner might just be the most formidable being in the room. As Professor Krelix watched Maya work through another impossibly complex equation, he reflected on the lessons learned. The universe was vast and full of surprises, and the greatest mistake any sapient being could make was to assume they understood another species based on surface observations. After all, who would have thought that the most dangerous predator in his classroom would be the small, pale creature who asked polite questions and took notes with a primitive writing instrument? Maya looked up from her work and caught him staring. "Is everything okay, Professor?" Professor Krelix smiled, his ocular sensors focusing on the human who had quietly revolutionized everything he thought he knew about Deathworlders. "Everything is perfect, Miss Torres. Absolutely perfect."